Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Heidi from My Reading Life, and I'm here today to do my week 2 wrap up of Nonfiction November. And so the first book that I completed in this week was this one, Evicted by Matthew Desmond. And this nonfiction is sort of an ethnographic study, or it's ethnographic and journalistic in its focus, where Matthew Desmond lived amongst some of the poorest people in the city of Milwaukee in the United States to understand better what their lives were like in terms of their housing. In America, through this book we learn that 1 in 8 people rent, and renting is certainly higher in urban areas in the United States than it is in rural areas. This book was really eye-opening to me in terms of what the poorest people in America go through in order to secure housing. It's just unbelievable, the humiliations and the degradations that they are exposed to simply because they're poor. And Desmond uses Milwaukee as a lens to look at this issue that basically applies to the entire United States for the most part. So basically Desmond lived with in amongst these folks for 2 years, in 2008 and 2009, and he basically followed 8 family groups during this time and documented their lives during that period. And he found a lot of interesting things. Some of the facts that came out in this book just kind of blew my mind. Like 67% of the poor renting families receive no federal assistance. Like the very poorest of the poor receive no federal assistance in their housing, and therefore they're thrust into the private rental market, where predatory practices by landlords basically make them fall further and further behind, and it's less and less likely that they're ever going to secure permanent housing. The poorest people spend 70 to 80% of their income on their housing. It seems that the poorer you are, the higher the percentage of your income you pay on housing, whereas the rule of thumb that I've always heard has been you should be spending about 30% of your income on housing. And so Desmond also does a nice job of looking at things from the perspective of the landlords and also from the perspective of the renters. And he really does do a good job of not taking sides, but at the end you're left with this knowledge that while the landlords aren't necessarily doing things illegally, ethically there's a big old question mark about, by law maybe you aren't required to provide things like appliances, but in not providing those things to the very poorest people that you're renting to, that it's going to be very difficult for them to actually survive in your housing. Or by buying a dilapidated old building and not doing any improvements to it and renting that unit out just the way it is, because if you don't put any money into it, there are people that are desperate enough to live there anyway, and then if they fall behind on that rent, you can just evict them, and so your costs are low and it's basically all income. And it's just really, it's unbelievable. In fact, the one of the landlords that Desmond follows is a woman named Jahren, and she is quoted as saying the hood is good, basically, that she has been able to make a very good living on renting to the very poorest people. And Desmond doesn't just focus on Black Americans, he also looks at things that are happening with the poor white community, although in Milwaukee, poor whites and poor Blacks tend to be segregated into like a north and south section of the city, and they don't often intertwine in terms of where people live, and that's due to lots of systemic causes from the history of housing and how housing has been developed in this country. And it's very clear from some of the families that Desmond follows that white people, even very poor white people with a history of eviction and criminal records, have an easier time renting than do Black people, even with better with no criminal record or with less eviction problems. So there's that racial aspect of what's happening with housing as well. Another fact that I found just truly astounding is in the city of Milwaukee, if they have a law that if tenants call 911 too many times, that's considered a nuisance and people can be evicted just for calling 911. So a young woman who calls 911 because her partner is physically abusing her, and if that happens, the landlord can evict her at that point. So not only does she go through she has the problem of she's experiencing physical abuse at the hand of a partner, now she can't even call for help, because if she does, she's going to get evicted, and then she'll be on the street with no place to go. So it's just, while the subject matter was truly distressing and disheartening, the way that Desmond wrote this book, it was so intensely readable. It's very written in a very narrative style. It's the facts are interwoven into the stories of these 8 families, and you just come to care and want to know what happens to them so much. And the description of how poor people live in this country is just unbelievable. And Desmond makes a very good job of hammering his point home that in this country, as wealthy as we are, we need to deal with the fact that there isn't any right to housing, that we haven't addressed housing as an issue, that until people have permanent and stable housing, the rest of their lives can never get better. And I would highly recommend Evicted to anyone who's looking for a very good nonfiction read. The next book that I completed was my audiobook, and I spoke about this last week, and it was When to Rob a Bank, and 31 more warped suggestions and well-intended rants by Stephen Leavitt and Stephen Dubner, who are the authors of the best-selling book Freakonomics and its sequel. And this book was good but not great. It's a collection of blog posts and essays that Leavitt and Dubner have written and posted online in various places over the last decade and more. And some of them were super interesting, like, for example, when they discuss what's causing the congestion in the greater New York area in the airports. And everybody thinks that Newark and JFK and LaGuardia are just so busy that that's what causes the congestion. And in reality, what the problem is that the cones of airspace that surround those airports intersect. And so planes that are coming into whichever of the 3 airports have to wait until the planes, if you're coming into Newark, there may be a plane coming into or out of JFK or LaGuardia that you have to reckon with before you can actually make your approach to Newark, because those airspaces overlap. So that the cheapest thing and the best thing to clear up congestion in those airports that could be done would be to basically shutter one of the airports, probably LaGuardia. But of course, nobody wants to do that because of the fact of some people prefer one airport or the other because of where they live and all of these things. So probably the congestion is never going to be dealt with. So there were like little snippets like that I found incredibly interesting. There was a really touching and heart-wrenching essay written by Stephen Leavitt's father, I believe, upon the death of his sister, who died from a very fast-acting brain tumor. And it sort of, the Stephen Leavitt's father is a doctor, and he sort of talks about how the medical system works and doesn't work when somebody who's otherwise apparently healthy is struck with a very malignant form of cancer, and that sort of the illness and subsequent death happens very quickly, and how our medical system is not very good at dealing with something like that. That was beautiful as well, but there were portions of it that were very slow and I did not like as well. So good with the bad, as is the case with lots of these kind of collections. Take that for what you will. The last thing I completed in the week, just finished it this morning, was My Family and Other Animals by Gerald Durrell. This is a book about Durrell and his family who moved from England and to the Greek island of Corfu in, I don't think it ever says exactly what the time frame is, but it's the early 1900s, I would say, probably like 1920s, 1930s, in that area. And Durrell is like obsessed with animals and natural world, and so it just basically is him telling stories. He was like 10 years old when they moved there, about the animals he encounters, the natural world that he explores on the island of Corfu, and then all the different characters, the people that he is intertwined with as well, from his family members to other residents of this island. It was charming, it was funny, there was lots of great animal stories. As you know, they have quite a menagerie that they collect over the years that they live on this island. And at the very end, when they're moving back from Corfu, like after several years of living on the island, because Jerry, as he's called, has to have more formal schooling, the customs agent on one of the stops writes, after he looks at all of their stuff, because they're traveling with this whole menagerie of animals and all these people, writes about the family, one traveling circus and staff. And that's basically what this book is. And it was great fun, and I loved it, and I would highly recommend it. And then for what I'm currently reading and listening to, my current audiobook that I just started this morning is Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jahren. This book, it was a winner of a Pulitzer, I believe, and it is about the natural history of humans, and why the author evidently is going to try to be answering the question of why whites of European descent have been able to conquer and subjugate so much of the less developed world that tends to be brown people, and what factors. Basically, he is making the argument that is not biological to the human species, but that it is based on environmental factors, so where the different groups of humans started out, and those conditions in those areas have led to this sort of segregation between the developed world and the undeveloped world, and why some cultures developed steel and other cultures were stone tools. So it's going to go back in history to the time when we diverged from the great apes and follow it all the way up through to modern times. So I've heard great things about this book, and hopefully that it will really work for me. The other two books, just started this one, Lab Girl by Hope Jahren. Only read the first 10 pages. Already really love the writing style. Hoping that it continues on through the rest of it. And I am still working my way through A Lincoln by Ronald C. White Jr. And I am up to page 192 on this chunker, and feel like I'm making very good progress on that. So another pretty successful reading week. I squeaked in a third one under the wire here before I did my little wrap up, so I'm feeling pretty good about that. Hoping that next week, where it's a Thanksgiving holiday, that I really dig in and get several more books completed. And then one exciting piece of news that I wanted to share with you all, and that is that I got a new tattoo this week. And since it's related to reading, I thought I would share it with you. And it is, you can see, this awesome stack of books on my arm. And the initials that are on the spines of those books are my children's initials. And so I just had this tattoo done on Wednesday. It already looks great. I'm super excited about it. I've been thinking about getting a tattoo. This is not my first tattoo, but I've been thinking about getting this particular tattoo for several years, and finally pulled the trigger and decided to go for it last Wednesday. Super excited about it. So great week for me, and I hope everybody else out there had a good reading week as well, and I will talk to you later.